Yeah. So today we'll be starting with the design lecture. So we're going to be going over color theory. But first, we're going to have some announcements for y'all. So homework and lab 3 are both due right now. So submit them at the link on the slides. I've linked the slides. I've also linked the form in the chat here. And also we've got a submission form change. So because we run out of storage, because of all of the huge files, we're now only accepting Google Drive links. So we'll be posting some more details on that on Piazza. We'll give you a kind of guide on how to submit the sharing link if you don't know how to use that, but we're going to be making sure to get links only from now on, and it'll be your responsibility to get that right and make sure that you've shared your files with us. Moving on from that, we are going to release the midterm project tonight. So again, there'll be an announcement on Piazza about that. So make sure to keep your eyes out for that. There'll be a deadline next week for a checkpoint on the 7th. And then the overall project is going to be due on the 19th. So top projects will be selected to present in lab on the 21st. So that's something to either get excited about or dread because it's midterm season. And then final links, as always, give us anonymous feedback. We'd like to hear what we can do well, what we've already done well. And remember to add to our class playlist because it's the same songs and we play them every single time and it's getting a bit sad. So moving on to content, we're going to be looking at color theory today. So we're starting off with some basic terminology. And these are going to be terms that you'll be looking at if you do any kind of digital design. So digital art, maybe if you're editing photos, you should know these 3 terms. They'll come up on software pretty often. So hue, value, and saturation. Okay, so hue is what colors are. So you can see it's kind of highlighted, that rainbow bar on the right-hand side of the square. And so your hue might be like red, blue, indigo, green. That's kind of what the hue represents. So it's going to be somewhere along this rainbow spectrum. Looking at value, value is how bright a color is. So that will be going from, say, like dark to light. It will be light blue. Say your hue is blue. So you've got light blue or dark blue. So how close it is to the top of the spectrum where it's white or the bottom of the spectrum where it's black. And then we've got saturation. So saturation is how intense the color is. You might see here it's got a horizontal range, and on the left, sorry, it's kind of got a monochrome from white to black, or it goes to gray to black. And on the left, on the right here, it's definitely much more brighter. So you've got an intense blue, and then even going down, it's kind of like an intense dark blue. So that's what saturation is. And going on to the slide, you'll be able to see a GIF that demonstrates here in the middle, it's the mid-tone saturation, but on the right here, it's like a very intense blue, kind of like a error screen kind of blue. And then on the left, you've got a blue that's almost gray. So that's the low saturation blue. Here on the right in the graphic that says shade and tint, these aren't words you necessarily need to know, but good to know. If it's a shade, then it's added pure black to the middle color of blue. And if it's tinted, then it's adding pure white to the middle color of blue. So that's why this one's lighter and the one on the left is darker. So getting those basic terms down, let's look at how we actually pick colors. So this is the part that's really relevant to your web design, right? So looking at colors first, we need to know what the color wheel is. This might be something you've looked at in elementary school, but just reviewing, here you've got the color wheel with your primary colors, red, yellow, blue, and then how they mix to form the secondary colors, orange, green, and purple. And this is how all the colors relate to each other. And this will be pretty relevant to when you're picking colors or how you decide colors look good next to each other. These following slides will have a lot of links in the bottom left corner, I think. So you'll be able to explore more, or there'll be links to useful resources. So make sure you do look at the slides. Again, they're linked in the chat. So yeah, okay, looking at colors, picking colors that actually looks nice is kind of a science. So you're going to look at what kind of colors harmonize together. And there are actually a few formulas for this, essentially. So here we've got 3 examples. On the next slide, there'll be 6, but these are the main 3 that you might be looking at. The first being complementary colors. So these are going to be colors opposite each other on the color wheel we just looked at. So for example, we've got orange and blue, but another example might be red and green or yellow and purple. So these 2 colors would look good together. Looking at triadic colors, this is kind of like 3 colors equally spaced around the wheel. So here we've got kind of a red, yellow, blue combination, and we could also have orange, purple, green, for example. And so picking colors in a triangle around the wheel will also pretty much look good. And then finally, this is something that you see quite commonly, I guess it's analogous colors. So 3 colors or more colors side by side. And this is what forms a lot of gradients and why gradients look good. So we'll be looking a bit more at that later. But here is kind of 6 more or 3 more of the wheels that we've looked at, or the harmonic combinations. So in addition to complementary, analogous, and triadic, we've also got monochromatic, which is 1 color but different shades of the color. Split complementary, which is 2 colors and then the opposite one on either side. So here we've got like the opposite of purple in addition to the ones on either side of this purple. And then we've also got tetradic. So instead of equally spaced 3 around the wheel, which is triadic, we've also got the square spaced around the wheel, and that might also look good. So picking these colors in a combination like this will usually end up looking quite nice on your palette, but it's also a matter of experimentation. So since you might not always want to pick everything out yourself, there are a lot of color palette generators online. So here we've got one linked here, but also I just wanted to point out how, for example, they've got some kind of popular color combinations at the bottom here, right? So applying what we just looked at, say the one on the rightmost here, this one that's mostly blues, this is an example of monochromatic color harmony. So it's just 1 color and there's different shades of the same color, right? And then here, second from the right, we've got one that's an example of an analogous color palette. So it's kind of 3 colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. So we've got a kind of light green, a dark green, and a blue, and they look really good together because it applies to the color harmonies. And then another example here that also looks pretty good, there's the primary colors, so red, yellow, blue, and they form the, I guess, the triadic example. So if you look at a lot of color palette generators, it seems quite random, like they'll output all these hex codes for you to use, but really they will actually abide by these color harmonies. So here linked is another kind of color website, color palette generator website that you can use for when you pick your colors for your own website. Yeah, and then here we've got a gradient generator that you can also use. So looking at what we talked about with analogous and monochromatic color harmonies as well. So monochromatic color harmonies, again, are the ones where you just pick 1 color and there's different shades, like from dark to light of the same color, right? And a lot of gradients you see are actually like this, and that's why they look so nice, because they abide by that. And then some other ones, for examples, are the analogous ones. So this one goes from red to orange to yellow, and that's the 3 colors side by side. That also looks really great. Yeah, so I guess moving on from how you might pick colors, let's just talk about the vibes of certain colors. So when it comes to web design, you might be thinking, oh, like I want to express a certain thing, or I want people to do a certain action on my website, right? So for example, certain colors evoke certain emotions or like provoke people to do certain things. So red is a very emotionally intense color. They use it for DoorDash or to make you hungry, or they use it for Tinder to kind of like make you want to fall in love, things like that. Like there are associations between certain colors and certain emotions. So another example, So for example, you might use red for actions or kind of designs that want to express really bold emotions. But another example of this is, for example, using blue as like a very reliable and calm color. I think blue is something that doesn't tend to be very noticeable. So it's quite a staple for a lot of kind of productivity apps or social media, because they don't want to wear you out by making you stare at like such a really intense color for a long time, right? So you'll notice that, for example, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of social media will use blue because they kind of want to keep you there. It's easy on the eyes and they want you to keep strolling. And it builds trust and rapport with your users. And then moving on to yellow. Yellow is a bright and creative color, and you'll see it's kind of like very eye-catching, even comparable to in real life. When you go to a sale, for example, they'll have lots of kind of like sale signs that's in yellow to kind of catch your attention and make you decide, oh, like this is something that I want to buy, or it kind of has an association with trendiness and quick decision making. So examples here are Amazon, so you can click add to cart and buy a million things. Awesome. So we're going to look at just finally some practical applications and tips in web design. So now that you know some basic things about colors, we're going to look at how you actually really apply them in your web design to make sure that your design is accessible, that's usable, and that works well with your colors. So one thing that we'd like to note first is contrast. So contrast is pretty important because it decides on the visibility of the things on your page. So for example, your text and the background, if it's kind of like you choose two colors that are low contrast, or you choose two colors that are too close to each other, then it's going to be difficult to read, right? So looking at the GIF on the side, contrast is the difference between two colors and whether or not they're bright enough or whether or not you can read the different colors, right? And so don't do this because then people will hate your site and never go to it. Instead, you should be being mindful about choosing colors so that people can understand or like differentiate between two elements on your site easily. And then, for example, if you pick button colors that are like stand out or are visible, that means it improves the usability of your site. An effective way to check if your colors have good contrast, here we've linked a website called accessiblecolors.com, and you can actually input some hex codes and it will tell you what the ratio is between the colors and tell you whether it's a good color combination or not for text. And then another example is you can desaturate your colors. So when we talked about saturation, that's how bright or like, no, sorry, how colorful kind of, or how intense the color is, right? So if you make everything gray and it's just the tones or it's just how dark or light it is, you'll be able to see whether or not they have high contrast. So a better example or a better kind of description is here. So you can see these two have lots of contrast, and when they turn to gray, you can kind of still see the shape of the square. But with these ones, they're kind of really pale and they're all really pale colors. And then when they turn to gray, it kind of just fades in the background. So you want to make sure that no matter what, your shapes are still able to be visible. So if you desaturate your colors, you'll be able to check that. And then we're just moving on. Another quick tip that's irrelevant to contrast, but tip in design, no one actually uses pure black. The reason I think is because pure black tends to be quite harsh on the eyes. And if you look at things like dark mode for say Discord or other sites, you'll actually realize that most of them have a dark gray background. So if you're gonna make a website in dark mode, be sure to choose some kind of like dark hex code like #333 or another dark gray. All right, so we've equipped you with all these kind of color palette generators and things to help you find the perfect color scheme, right? This is pretty cute. Again, it's got the triadic harmony, and then maybe on the side, it's got the analogous harmony. So it's a nice color palette. But if you do it like this, it kind of looks like, I don't know what this looks like. Maybe it looks like a kindergarten advertisement, right? So with this, you want to make sure that you choose your colors. Even if it's a great color palette, you need to be able to allocate your colors well. So here's an example of the same color palette, but made to fit the UI in a way where each color is meaningful. So for example, the red here it's kind of like really bright and makes it hard to read the text. But here you save it solely for the notification kind of icon there to make sure that it catches their attention when they have a message or a notification. You have the yellows here, and then maybe you make them lighter so that it's more readable against the text. And you associate yellow with say like error messages or something to catch your eye. So that's something that's good to allocate for this error message, right? So make sure that even if you have your great color palette down, allocate it in a way that makes sense for the user and can be relaxing for them and isn't necessarily kind of like I don't know what to call this, like a clown UI. Avoid clown UIs. And then finally, we've got another tip just to match your color scheme with your images. So if you have your images already, that's pretty great. And it can actually help you decide which colors to use in your UI. So here, for example, we've taken colors out of the images and then used them in other kind of aspects of the website. And that means for you, it looks more cohesive in general. So if you have too many colors in your color palette, it just becomes a little bit messy and then there's like too many things to look at or you aren't sure where to look. But if you keep it to a limited color palette, then it gives the user more consistency. They know like to associate certain colors with certain buttons or certain functions in the website. And that makes it really comfortable and also just makes the whole thing look way neater. So that's our design lecture for today. Yep, there are no more slides, but I hope that equips you with the ability to pick a nice color palette, to make a website that has good contrast, and to avoid clown UIs. I think now we're going to take a break technically, because that's the end of our first lecture. After that, we are going to have the programming lecture. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for recording. All right, can everyone see the slides over here? Okay, great. All right, so for this week's programming portion, we will be talking about positioning and centering using CSS, which you'll find you use a lot. Okay, so first, a few reminders of things we've already learned. When it comes to formatting in CSS, you want to remember to give units to your numbers the way like science teachers always say. So for font size, you might want to do pixels. For other things, you might want to do like transition 0.2s for seconds. And you also want to end each line with a semicolon just so that the processor like knows it's the end of a line. And also when it comes to hover effects, you don't need to put any spaces between the selector and the colon hover. So you just do a colon hover, no spaces in between. Let me check the chat really quickly. Oh, okay, cool. A few more CSS reminders. You can write out the full path for a nested selector. Like over here, if you're trying to select A, it doesn't hurt to do class big, class container, and A, but that's not really necessary. If you know that you want to affect all of the A's, you can just do point A and write whatever you want. The only time I could see this being really useful is if you had like a big container and a little container, and you only wanted the A within the big container to be affected. Doing this will kind of stop the like little A container from being affected. But for your purposes in this class, you probably don't need to do that very often. All right, so before we begin with our new content, I'll just remind you guys of the HTML skeleton. Whenever you write something on a page without any formatting, it usually just goes one below the other. And you use a lot of divs. The way you can think of these divs is as containers with parents and children, parents being container, children being whatever is inside of that. And that will help us a lot with positioning. And yeah, so when you do change things, you'll usually change things relative to other elements on the page. So a lot of the time you'll like have a child that you'll want to move relative to its container. And another reminder from some of our design lectures, when it comes to the elements on the page, you really want to think of them as blocks, whether they're text or buttons or images. Thinking of them as blocks or space will really help you when you're designing the layout and figuring out how to position everything. And yeah, like I've been saying, when it comes to divs and boxes, these things are really important when it comes to positioning them. When we position them, we're disrupting how they normally are. So instead of just one below the other, we're changing it so that they might be next to each other or like overlapping each other. Yeah, just changing where they are on your page. All right, so we can get started with learning all of our new content. First of all, here are the 4 values that will go into the position property in CSS. We're going to go really more into depth in this in the next few slides, but I'll just give you a quick rundown of what they each mean. So a position of none just means that it goes according to the normal flow, top to bottom. Relative means that it's kind of offset relative to where it normally would be in the normal flow. Absolute, it's instead of being relative to itself, where it would be, it's relative to its closest ancestor. And I'll go into what that means. And then finally, fixed is pretty simple. It's just fixed somewhere within the viewport, within your window, and it won't move no matter how much you scroll. All right, so default, AKA normal flow, AKA having a position of none. You can see A, B, and C are just stacked on top of each other horizontally within this parent container. Nothing special, just what automatically happens. Next, we're going to learn about something that's called relative. Instead of just being positioned where it normally is, you can affect it, like move it or nudge it a bit to a side based on where it normally would be. And you can also note that this will only affect that one element. It won't like push everything below it to go even lower. And an example on the next slide should make that clear. So over here, we can see that we haven't affected A or C, but instead of B having a position of none, we've given it a position of relative. And over here, you can see what top 20 pixels and left 20 pixels mean. So we've given it kind of a push 20 pixels from the top and also a push 20 pixels from the left. I guess you can also think of it as a space of 20 pixels at the top of it and a space of 20 pixels to the left of it. And also, yeah, you can see, even though we've affected B and it comes before C, C still goes according to the normal flow of the page. Here you can see other directions to move it. So it's still relative, but it's adjusted left and bottom with no right or top value. And the axis stays the same. This was where it would have started if it just had like 0 for everything, but instead it's got pushed 50 from the left and then 20 from the bottom. All right, the next one, and let me check the chat really quickly. So by default, is top referencing margin top, or is it something else? Oh yeah, it's the position. Like if you do margin top, it might also kind of push it like that. But usually when it comes to positioning stuff, you'll want to use like an actual position thing, because it's not really, you're not really like defining it in terms of that one element, and you don't want that to be like, you know, the star element pushing everything else away from it. You kind of want it to be like, oh, here are all the items on the page and here are their positions and how they affect each other, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to absolute. So when it comes to absolute things, it's a little similar to position, to relative, in terms of an item like moving from a fixed point that it normally would be at. But instead of just moving from where it would be according to the normal flow of the page, it's moved with the 0 point being its closest relatively positioned ancestor. Let me check the chat again. Okay, yeah, exactly what Isabel said. Okay, so over here, you can't see B, okay, you can see B up at the top there, and you can see with position absolute, it's moved it there because this whole thing is like the container, and you've given it right 0 pixels, meaning there's 0 pixels like separating it from the right of the container, and then top 0 pixels, so 0 pixels at the top of the container. And again, yeah, this is just like moved, but this time C is actually affected and it kind of gets pushed up to replace where B used to be. Okay, so we can kind of break down what happened and like, why did things break and go out of our container? It's because we don't have the class container positioned. Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, when it comes to an absolute position thing, you have 2 parts of it. One part is the child of B being affected, but you also need to have another element that's positioned to be relative. All right, so this time you can see that the container is given position relative, and now B really sticks to have 0 pixels at the top and 0 pixels at the right. Before, the closest positioned, like relatively positioned ancestor was just the whole page. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind if you find that your absolute elements aren't really where they're supposed to go. Okay, so now what if you want to put things on top of each other, as in overlapping things on the page? So you can still do position relative for your container. And if you give all of your elements within that, so the child elements, the position of absolute, the default is just having like 0 left, 0 top. So they'll all be positioned to the top left, because that's kind of, you know, the default place within that container. Yeah, you can see there's that 0 axis and all of them are positioned absolutely. So they all fall there. Yeah, you can think of the relatively positioned ancestors as the origin point for absolute positioning. This goes hand in hand with the like normal flow place as the origin point for relative positioning. Okay, so here is kind of a real world example where absolute positioning would be helpful. It's just the Airbnb sign up page. But you can see if you wanted this little box to kind of be on top of the bigger picture would be your relatively positioned container. Because yeah, like it's the bigger thing and it's kind of the container because it's, yeah, it contains the other thing. So of course, this would become the thing that you give an absolute position to. Then the way you would do this would probably be by doing like top 150 maybe, and then left 100, just to push it from being exactly in the corner. Okay, and then lastly, we have position fixed. Again, this pulls the element out of the normal flow, but the thing that it's positioned relative to isn't just another element that moves as you scroll, it's the entire window. So a lot of times, or always, this will never move. And that makes a lot of sense because it's called fixed. Yeah, so here we can see we've added an element that's like the navigation bar. We've given it 0 pixels to the left and the top. So it's just flush to left and top, and in this case also right. And with a position of fixed, you can see even as you scroll up and down on the page, it will remain at the top. Yeah. And one place we've used this is actually for that top banner on our site. You might have noticed it did not move as you scrolled. That's because it had a fixed position. All right, so we've talked a bit about positioning. Now we're going to talk about centering. And there's a few different ways to center things too. If you're trying to center things horizontally, such as these elements over here, you can do margin right and margin left, both as auto. It kind of makes sense. Like if you tell something to, have automatically just like whatever value in margin left and right, it'll probably be even because nothing else makes much sense. And shorthand for this, you can also just do margin 0 auto. I don't really know if there's a trick for remembering this, but yeah, just like automatic thing, what might look the best, what like your mind would go to first is something like centering. When you want to vertically center something, and especially if it has absolute positions, this is going to be what you're doing. And so big potato is just this rectangle over here. If you first give it top 50%, then yeah, as we talked about, an absolute position means it's positioned relative to this container. So it's pushed it down 50%. This isn't centered yet. So what you want to add, you're going to do transform, translate Y, and then minus 50%. And that'll kind of just like push it back up to be exactly in the center. All right, we can also center things. And you can manually do it, but here is kind of like the shorthand for it, I guess. So in just the same way as we centered something vertically, we can also center it horizontally by doing left 50% and then again, translating it back 50%. And if you do translate, these two values will just be X and Y. Okay, a few more notes before we end. First, z-index. So when it comes to overlapping elements, z-index is how you can determine which thing is on top of the other. Right now, B is just kind of by default on top of A, but if we want A to be the one on top, we can just specify the z-index of A to be greater than the z-index of B. So yeah, 1 will always be above 0, 2 will be above 1, and I think this increases infinitely. So you can layer a bunch of things on top of each other. Another thing to note is that you don't need any units for z-index. Unlike what I was talking about earlier in the reminders with like fonts having pixels, you just do 0, 1, 2, 3, and keep counting up. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand. Because if not, I think we are done pretty early. Yeah, okay. Cool. Well, thank you for coming. I know lab has been released for this week. I think homework is coming soon.
I think there's a
Isabel?
question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Can you explain Airbnb? Oh, sure. Let me go back to that slide, actually. Okay, I think we're almost there. Okay, two more. Okay, so let me look in the chat again. Or okay, I can answer the Airbnb thing first. So what this was just kind of showing is a case when absolute positioning would be really helpful. You might be thinking like, oh, why would I use absolute when I have to deal with another element instead of just using relative for all the elements? But this just shows that when you have two elements that you want to position relative to each other, rather than kind of like your whole layout, it can be really helpful. And so if you just think of this whole image as the container, you can see that if you just put absolute, like position as absolute for this one sign up square, instead of it normally being like, instead of it normally having the image here and then the like little sign up box below it, it like already positions it. So it's like at the very top of that image, if that makes sense. And you were able to really easily just push it down and to like from the left, the amount you want it, instead of having to be like, okay, so it's like under this image right now, how far do I have to move it up? But it's like absolute and relative positions still, you can move them in the exact same way, if that makes sense. I hope I answered your question. Yeah, it was just like an example of it. So I'll just move on to Wilson's question, and you can like type in the chat if that was okay. So if the parent object is relative, would the child object's absoluteness be dependent on its parent? Okay, yeah. Basically, something that you can think of with absolute is that it can't exist on its own. Like you never want to see an absolute element either like with no relative elements on the page or even with no relative elements that are containers of it. Let me look at your question again. Yeah, okay, so yeah, so basically absoluteness, like if it doesn't have a parent, then the parent is going to be like the whole page, the way it was on a previous slide. Let me see if I can get back to that. That I can just show how the B block yeah, so over here it has the parent and the parent is already positioned to be relative. So it falls within the container, but with no parent. Okay. If you have no parent, it kind of breaks and just like goes to the top of the page because it's like right in top 0. So yeah, if that clears it up a bit, you just always want to have a relative parent. And if it's a situation where you feel like you don't want to have a relative parent or there's no like natural seeming relative parent, you might just want to use the relative position because that would work better in that case. Yeah, okay, awesome, Wilson, I'm glad. Okay, then can you explain how transform works? Sure, okay. Let me actually exit from full screen so I can like get to the right slide without clicking through 20 of them. Transform over here. Okay. Oops, not that. Okay, so I guess one way you could think of it in this case, because you're just using translate, it's just like, you know, top or left, just like moving something because it's translate. It's helpful in this case to use that, but transform can also have property values that are like rotate. Maybe there might be like a flip one, you can just Google it, but in this case, I'm pretty sure it's like moving it back 50% is 50% of like how much it's already been moved. I don't know if one of the instructors wants to jump in here, but yeah, usually when I do it, like in this scenario, I would just do 50%. I haven't really played around with other translate values. It's just kind of like a trick we use when we want to center something. It's always paired with, like top 50% and then translate Y, or left 50% and then translate X, or both of them. Yeah, I'm glad that makes sense. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah, or if you want me to just like go through a certain section of slides again, I can totally do that too. Okay, I see someone put something in the chat, why the parent has to be relative. Sure, yeah. So when it comes to absolute positioning, you just kind of need to have a relatively positioned parent. That's kind of like the function of absolute elements. There's no like theory behind it. I don't think. It's just like if an absolute element didn't have to have a relative parent, then you could just use the position of relative instead of absolute. Because the whole point of absolute is that it's positioning like something relative to a container. Because you do like left a certain number of pixels or top a certain number of pixels for both relative and absolute. The only difference is that doing it relatively will start it just from where it normally would be, whereas doing it relatively would start it from where it normally would be, whereas doing it absolutely would start it from the same starting point as a container. Yeah. So maybe if I gave an example, like there was the Airbnb thing, but I can also imagine maybe if you're like writing an article and you want to kind of like embed, put a photo that starts in the same place as the text instead of like below that chunk of text. You could just do relative positioning there and like move it way up, do like bottom 200 pixels, which would move it up 200 pixels.